In this video, we are going to look at the sampling workflow and how we can use it to optimize our renders and render times. There is, of course, more to optimizing your renders and scenes than just the sampling workflow. The principal other things that affect our render times are the types of lights that we use and the types of situations that we use them in. And when I say lights, I also include in that global illumination, how we treat that in terms of background or not, brute force, interpolation, and so on. All of that, of course, is covered in other videos in this series, and we see in those videos how there are some nice, simple rules that you can follow and apply scene after scene after scene in exactly the same way to ensure that you get the optimum render quality in the shortest amount of time. What will be far more variable from scene to scene and will change depending on your lighting setup, the types of materials you have, and so on, is your sampling settings. And so that's what we're going to investigate here. Now, hopefully you'll recall from the initial videos in the Foundation series, specifically the one on ray tracing basics and the, basic background of how a ray trace renderer works, that each pixel in your image gets sampled from light incoming and outgoing from all the different directions, and the sum of adding together all of these different samples of the reflection, of the diffuse, of the lighting, the GI, and so on and so on and so on, these calculate the final colour, the rendered colour of each pixel. And of course, the more samples we use, the more we converge on what the true value of that pixel should be. Thus, the rule for quality with sampling is very simple. More samples, more quality, because you are getting closer to the true value of the render. However, that said, you can't just crank them up willy-nilly. Well, you can just crank them up willy-nilly, just turn them up, more samples, better render, but not necessarily an optimal render time for that given quality. The reason for that is this: although 2018's PBR renderer is a fully ray traced renderer, all of the effects are ray traced, the GI, the subsurface, the reflection, the refraction and translucency and so on. It doesn't contain any sort of cheat methods like, the good old Blinn, specular cheat methods or anything like that. That does not mean that there are not strategies that can be used in the rendering code to help optimize things while still doing true ray tracing. Obviously, that gets into really complicated stuff, and it's mostly just math and procedural tricks of cleverness. But there are certain examples that we've seen, like, for instance, importance sampling, where a background image or an image-based light, area lights, environment lights, they can sort of be pre-scanned, in inverted commas, to figure out which areas are the most important in terms of illumination and concentrate more samples in that sort of pattern. And it's for that reason that arranging the samples in our renderer setup can be optimized in a certain way to give us quicker renders without sacrificing render time. And that, of course, is why we'll find that there are sample settings scattered about throughout the interface. For instance, of course, we have the main samples over here for reflection, refraction, and subsurface scattering. These are some of our shading samples, obviously our shading effects. In global illumination, we have the number of rays that we set when we're using brute force GI, or of course the primary and secondary rays that are used when we are using interpolated GI. These are still samples. As we see in the GI video, when we're using rays in brute force, then it's like sampling a light. This is samples per pixel. When we're using interpolated, it's samples per cell. Furthermore, in our light properties, we have a sample setting for each light. We also have the number of importance samples that are used for lights that do use importance sampling. Again, there's the same on GI for ISBG importance sampling here when we use background radiosity, which is rare. And finally, of course, we have these sample settings here on the camera itself, the minimum and maximum camera samples, and this adaptive sampling toggle. And we want to get the balance of all these different samples just right. So let's take a look at how we do that. First of all, let's see what we've got in our scene here. Well, we've just got a couple of, simple little shapes, but we've got every type of effect present. So we've got the ground and the red tortoise here. These are just diffuse. They've got no specular or anything else like that. We've then got the blobby shape, which is made out of glass here, so that has refraction and transmission. It also has some specular to it. We've got this blue sphere on the side here, which is reflective quite slightly, and it's also slightly rough. You can see the reflection of our light there is a bit soft. We've got this other blobby shape over here, which has subsurface scattering on. It also has reflection. And we've got only one light in this scene, which is an area light. Of course, that is giving us soft shadows here, which require sampling. No GI at present, but we will tap that on in a little bit and take a look at that in due course. So the first thing that I want to do is to show the equivalency of sampling, which is how we might ordinarily expect sampling to work. I'm going to start this off by just throwing all of our materials just over to plain standard, no reflection or refraction or anything else, just simple diffuse. We're going to take all of our samples here down to 1. We're going to make our light sample 1, and we're going to kill our adaptive sampling, and so we'll leave our camera sample on 1. And there we go, that's one sample. Again, remember back to the ray tracing basics video where we saw how the pixels in the ball that was reflecting the cube surrounding it were only one colour per pixel. When it was at one sample, you can see in the shadow here, a pixel is either black or it's, the ground colour because it's only been sampled once per pixel. So first of all, let's look at the equivalence of sampling. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my area light here and I'm going to give it 12 samples. Okay, I'm just going to nip it out of VPR because I want to show this in the main F9 render. So we'll just kick that off. Okay, render time of 8.1 seconds. Here we can see the effect of 12 samples in our light. Let's just bring that up to 400% and let's have a look down here where we've got the soft shadow of the light. Okay, so that's more or less what it looks like. Let's try more, shall we? Let's go for 24 samples and render that again. Okay, 14 seconds. There we see, it is a bit smoother. That's with the 12, that's with the 24. Clearly it is smoothing up. Right, I said we were going to show the equivalency of samples. So let's set that back to 1 and let's set our camera samples here to 24 and render. Okay, and there we go. There is our render done again. And we can see that the quality is basically the same, right? So this is 24 camera samples, that's 24 light samples. Camera, light, camera, light, camera, light. 24 samples is 24 samples. Doesn't matter where we've entered them. So in one respect, this gives us something of a strategy if you just want to forget about it and be lazy, or if you're in a terrible rush. And that's that you can just leave all of this stuff, your reflection and refraction and lights and GI and everything, just leave it all on one sample and just crank up your camera samples until everything looks good. I should point out that is with the exception of interpolated GI, which has to do its own pass, but that would count if you were doing brute force. However, that is a bad strategy, especially if you're in a rush, because look at what has happened to our time. This one with 24 camera samples has taken 48 seconds, whereas if you recall, our 24 light samples took 14 seconds. Basically, we've gotten the same shading quality, but it's taken almost 4 times as long, just a little under 3.5 times as long. So what's the difference? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all is, as I said, just because everything is being fully ray traced doesn't mean there aren't strategies for optimization that the renderer can employ. And when it is the light that has got the sample number, then the renderer knows that pretty much all of the sampling that it needed to do was just coming from that light. And so in areas where there were soft shadows, it could perhaps be a bit more careful. And in areas that were unshadowed and fully exposed to the light, it didn't need to be quite so careful. Whereas when we're using camera samples only, it just blasted everything with a full sampling. The other thing that's going on, and it's not so obvious with the numbers that we've used here, but sampling is multiplicative. Here's how you should think of it working. We say that the camera has a certain number of samples, and that's true, they are samples in the effect of how we've talked about sampling. But you can think of them as passes. The amount of samples that get taken per pixel are the number of camera samples multiplied by the number of other samples. So light samples and the shading samples over here. And of course, for global illumination, the GI samples, in brute force that is. Again, interpolated sort of happens in its own space. So we could try something else, right? Let's try 3 camera samples, yep, and 8 light samples. 3 times 8, that's 24. Let's render again. Okay, 17 seconds. What do we see? Oh look, pretty much the same quality. So that's mixed sampling, that's camera samples, that's light samples. Camera, mixed, same quality. We can do this the other way round, so we could have 8 camera samples and 3 light samples, still 24. 8 times 3 is 24. There we go, now we're up to 24 seconds. Once again, look at that, the quality is pretty much the same as it was there. That hasn't changed at all. Of course, what we are seeing is that we get optimum render times, that is the lowest time for the same quality, when the number of samples we use in camera is low and the number of samples we use in lights are high, rather than the other way round. Now that starts to seem like a strategy for just always using one camera sample and just turning up our light and other samples until things look good. But let us go back to that 14-second render, where of course we were using light samples only and one camera sample, and look at the other things that we're getting though. Look at the jaggies here on the edge of the torus. Or of course, if we go up and look at the sphere, look at the jaggies. Look at that. Do we get that when we use the camera samples? No, it comes out smooth. That is because the camera samples are also our anti-aliasing samples. We can't just get away with one camera sample because we don't get any anti-aliasing on the edges of things, and so we just get all of these awful jaggies. In order to get rid of them, we do need camera samples. And this is where the final strategy, the best strategy for balancing your samples, begins to reveal itself. We want camera samples to be as low as possible. That much is obvious from the render time tests we've conducted. But we do need some measure of camera samples in order to get good anti-aliasing, get good edges and avoid jaggies. So here's how we do it. We'll set everything down to one sample. That's our shading samples, our global illumination. If it's in brute force mode, we'll take our lights and we'll put those down at one sample. And we'll go for our camera and we'll just find some sort of sample number that's not going to be 1, that's going to be, let's say, 5, shall we? And we make a render. VPR is probably a good place to do this because, of course, we can see the effects of things interactively. And we basically just look and judge, you know, how high our camera samples need to be just on the anti-aliasing of the edges. We can ignore the, you know, dirty, noisy shadows and any other surfaces that we've got going on. For the moment, we only care about the anti-aliasing. A good thing to do with this, especially if you've got, you know, some kind of open backdrop where everything isn't covered, or you can just swing your camera around to some angle whereby you can look, you know, towards an empty area, is to look at the alpha, because of course your alpha will be anti-aliased or not. So we can take a look at that. Okay, so I've got, what, 5 samples there. That's not bad. Can I get away with 4? Yeah, you know what, for this scene I can probably get away with 4. I've got a feeling that 3 is going to be just a little bit too low. Yeah, I can start to see the jaggies coming through on that now. So I think 4 is my bare minimum for this scene. Possibly 5 would be good. I generally find, if you're looking for a rule of thumb, 8 or 9 I find is a good minimum for most scenes. But of course, if you can get it down lower, do. it will save you render time by having fewer camera samples. But it looks like in this case I'm going to be able to go for 4, so that's grand. Now of course I'm saying edges in anti-aliasing. There is something else that camera samples sorts out for us, and that is camera effects, specifically motion blur and depth of field. So if I happen to be using depth of field, I've just turned on some depth of field effect here, then you would of course look at that and you would set your camera samples as high as was necessary to make that rendering, not noisy, or to an acceptable level of grain. In this case, the 4 samples would not cut it. 8 even, we can see for the level of, depth of field that I've got going on here is a little low. I'm probably going to be looking higher, possibly a good few higher. Yeah, 12, that's still a little grainy. I might even be needing to go as high as 24 camera samples to sort out this kind of depth of field. Yeah, not so bad. To be honest, I could probably go higher. I might be able to get away and that be acceptable. Again, having a look just at my full render rather than just the alpha channel here might give me more, insight in that way. But of course, that would be up to you. So if you're using motion blur or DOF, then of course you need to set your camera samples appropriately for that. But whatever you're doing, whether it's without motion blur and DOF or with, the first thing that you want to do is, ignoring everything else, get your camera samples at a level where your pure camera effects, anti-aliasing, motion blur, depth of field, get that so as that looks good enough, and get your camera samples down as low as is acceptable for the camera effects you are rendering. So what's the next step after that? Well, the next step is quite simply just to start turning up the other samples until all of the other effects become acceptable. You've got your camera samples, that is locked. Now we just turn up everything else. So with my main surfaces back on here, I'm just going to start turning up my other samples. So let's come to my camera and let's say 6 samples, shall I? That's bringing my lighting back up to 24 samples. Of course, 6 times 4, that's 24. And that was okay. It was perhaps still a bit grainy, and actually looking at it there, I would say that it is still a little bit grainy. So let's go perhaps 8. Of course, remembering that because of the multiplication, that's not 8 samples, it's 8 times 4. Every time I increase my light number by 1, I'm actually increasing it by 4. And yeah, that's a little bit grainy, but it's much better. Perhaps 9. 9 light samples. I think I'm going to be happy with that. Well, I'm happy enough. If I was going for, full production render, I'd probably want to go higher than that for a final production piece. But you're getting the idea. I just turn this up until I'm happy with it. And of course, I've only got the one light in this scene. If we had multiple lights in the scene, then I would go through those just one by one. I could have, of course, just grab all of them and turn them up to the same setting. But if you want to be optimal, go through them one by one and make sure that each of their shadows are coming out well. Easiest way to do that, of course, is to go through when you do have multiple lights in a scene and just toggle them on and off so that you can view the shadows from each one in isolation. Then, of course, we turn over here to our shading samples. So my reflection there is looking a bit grainy. Again, it can be really good to use the buffers here. So I'm going to go for the specular direct. This shows me straight my specularity. I might also look, of course, at the specular indirect, which is the secondary specular reflection. Sometimes this one is a good one to look at because the specular direct, if you've got area lights or environment lights, they're going to be importance sampled, so they will be nice and clean with low sampling. Secondary reflections, that is the direct ray traced reflections of the scene, they are often noisier, and it's for their reasons that you're going to need to turn up reflection samples. So looking at the specular indirect is often helpful, and look at that, we can see where I've got the reflection of the reflective, transparent blob here. That's really getting noisy, and also the reflection of the subsurface object is noisy. However, remember, part of that is my subsurface samples, not just the reflection samples. Keep that in mind if you do have things such as that. But in the meantime, I'm going to try 4 reflection samples. And yeah, there we go. The reflection of the reflection is coming up much more cleanly. I can see, of course, the reflection of the torus and the reflection of the ground plane there. That's looking much better. If I look on my blobby subsurface object where we've got the blue patch there, that's, of course, the reflection of the blue ball. That's looking a lot cleaner. The reflection of the reflection there is still a little bit noisy, so maybe we'll just come up to 5 samples. Again, remembering the multiplication, it's by 4, so by going up by 1 sample I've actually gone up by 4 samples, so I'm actually getting 20 reflection samples total now. And okay, I think I'm reasonably happy with that, so that's grand. What's next? My refraction samples. So there we go, I can just jump over to the refraction buffer here. I can say, hey, you know what, that's not too unclean at all. I don't have much refraction blurring on this object. I've got a little bit, but not much. Obviously, the more of that I had, the more I would need to turn up my samples. But I'm going to put that at 2 because it is just a little noisy only on 1. Of course, I've gone up by 2. Sorry, I've gone up by 1, which is actually going up by 4. I'm sure you get the message about the multiplication now. There we go, that looks much better than before, but I still think it's a little grainy, so let's go to 3. I'm pretty confident that'll be enough. Yep, good. I'm definitely happy with that, so there we go. Now it's just my subsurface scattering. So we'll just switch back so I can see this nice and properly all in context now, because it's the last thing I need to tweak. So obviously that SSS is a little bit noisy there. Let's try it at 3 samples. Okay, much cleaner with that, but still just a little bit grainy, especially where we've got the the area where it's self-shadowing. Let's try 5. Okay, much more pleasing. And basically, there we have it. There we go. Perhaps I'm going to add global illumination to the scene, so I'm not going to bother with interpolated. I'm not going to bother with backdrop, because I don't really have a backdrop here. It's just black. I'm just using the 1 light. I'm only going to use the 1 bounce in this case, but I'll turn on my GI. Obviously, 1 ray, so that's effectively 1 sample. Let's just have a look at the diffuse indirect here, because obviously that's where it's coming from. Yeah, that's pretty noisy, isn't it? In all likelihood, I'd probably need to go up to about 9, the same as my light. Let's have a look at it at, say, 4, shall we? Because obviously it's only gentle light. It might not need that many samples. Yeah, no, still a bit noisy. How's about 8? Okay, that's better. A little bit grainy, perhaps, but I think acceptable. So we'll jump back to our final render, and we'll just let that render up, and we can see that that's starting to look pretty nice. Right, the last thing then to take care of to optimize our whole thing is to look back at the adaptive sampling. What the adaptive sampling will do is basically it sets things up so that you can start on a low sample number, and the renderer will inspect the amount of noise as you're going along, looking at this threshold value here, and when the noise gets below that threshold, it will stop taking more samples, or it will continue until it hits the maximum sample number. So I've already determined that the camera samples I need are 4. So to use your adaptive sampling, you simply take that number, pop it into the maximum, and then start your minimum somewhere below that. Commonly, that will be 1, because of course then if the renderer comes across a pixel and it samples it once and it's like, hey, this is totally noise free, it can stop, and so it won't need to keep on sampling that pixel more and more and more. Otherwise, it will go until it either hits the maximum number of samples or it takes enough to get away from the noise, again within the threshold value here. You'll notice the default of 0.05. That's usually enough in most situations. If you really want to push the adaptive, get it down to 0.01 perhaps, but at that level you almost might as well not be using adaptive sampling at all. I'm going to go for 0.035 for this particular scene because there are a few little tight spots, like the GI on the backside of this torus and stuff like that. The other thing that I will point out about using adaptive sampling is that it can sometimes play up a bit when you're using camera effects such as motion blur and depth of field. You'll know it if you see it because you will start to get artifacts in your render. They'll be really quite obvious. They're kind of like holes that appear in your render. Generally, that tends to happen more if you've got really extreme effects, so really extreme, very shallow depth of field or very fast moving objects causing lots of motion blur. That's when the renderer tends to sort of choke a bit with its adaptive sampling and it can't render them properly. If you do come across a problem like that, the only thing that you can do is to not use adaptive sampling and, you know, put your minimum sample number to whatever that was. But in the event where you're either definitely not using those effects or they're not strong enough to cause the renderer to suffer artifacts, then turn on your adaptive sampling, keep your threshold low-ish, and that will further optimize the number of samples that are needed. And that is it. That is the most efficient render time that we can get for this given level of quality. If we want more quality, then we just, turn up our light samples, we turn up our shading samples, we turn up our GI samples. And that is the complete workflow. First of all, determine how many camera samples are needed for AA and any camera effects. Once you have gotten those smooth enough as you want them, then start turning up all of the other samples until these effects, the reflection, the subsurface, the refraction, the shadows, until each of those becomes acceptable in turn. If you follow that procedure, working from the camera outwards, then you will always get the minimum render time for your desired level of quality. And beyond that, all it really is doing is it's just dialing things up. As we said at the beginning, want more render quality? Turn up your samples. It's simply the order in which you do them that will determine how optimized your render times are. And so there we go. There's our final render of this scene. What have we taken? 2 minutes and 28 seconds. Not that long, really, when you consider that we've got GI and refractions and blurred reflections and subsurface scattering all going on in the scene together, reflecting and refracting each other, soft shadowed area light, and a reasonably decent level of quality. 2.5 minute render, not bad. We've optimized that very nicely, and there we have it. That is the sampling workflow for the renderer in 2018.